The air in the bunker was a physical thing, a hot, wet blanket smelling of sweat, ozone, and the slow decay of the jungle just outside the reinforced door. For Lieutenant Kinji Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Army's Signals Intelligence Unit, this was the scent of the war. He sat hunched over a Nakajima Type 92 radio receiver, a delicate headset pressed tight against his ears, filtering the universe down to a single, crackling hiss. Outside, on the island of Saipan, the world was ending in a symphony of American artillery. But in here, Tanaka was a god, a silent predator hunting for whispers in the static, for the secrets that flowed through the air on invisible waves. He was good. The best, his commander had said. He could feel the patterns in the ether, the subtle rhythms of an American naval transmission, the sloppy, almost arrogant cadence of a new army unit. He and his team had broken their codes before. The simple substitution ciphers, the more complex grid systems, they were all just puzzles, mathematical games played across thousands of miles of ocean. The Americans were clever, but they were logical. And anything logical could be understood. It could be beaten. His fingers, stained with ink, hovered over a notepad. He was listening to the U.S. Marines. The 4th Division. They were being chewed to pieces on the beaches, but their radio traffic was disciplined, almost serene. He'd been logging their transmissions for hours, predicting their requests for fire support, anticipating their casualty reports. It was a familiar, bloody dance. And then, it happened. A new voice cut through the noise. It wasn't the calm, measured English of a radio operator reading from a code book. This was something else. It was urgent, guttural, a cascade of sounds that felt impossibly ancient and terrifyingly new all at once. Tanaka's mind, a finely tuned instrument for linguistic analysis, recoiled. It wasn't a code. A code is a mask worn by a language you know. This was a language from a different planet. The syllables rose and fell like windswept mesas. Consonants clicked and popped like stones falling in a deep canyon. It was fast, impossibly fast, spoken with the desperate fluidity of men who were not translating, but thinking in this bizarre tongue. Tanaka ripped the headset from one ear, the bunker's oppressive quiet rushing in. He looked at his subordinate, Sergeant Ito, whose own eyes were wide with disbelief. Ito just shook his head. On the paper in front of Tanaka, his pen had frozen. What could he even write? The sounds were untranscribable. Daitai-hai, Eka, Wolachi. It was gibberish. But then, the artillery began to shift. The shells that had been falling harmlessly 1,000 meters to the east suddenly walked with terrifying precision onto a Japanese machine gun nest that had been holding up the entire Marine advance. The strange voice had spoken, and Steele had answered. It wasn't gibberish. It was a kill command. He jammed the headset back on, his heart pounding against his ribs. The alien tongue was back, reporting the strike, correcting the fire, directing the slaughter. It was a conversation happening in plain sight, a flagrant, arrogant display of communication that they were utterly powerless to intercept. It was as if the Americans were shouting their secrets, confident in the knowledge that the Japanese were deaf. For the first time in his decorated career, Kinji Tanaka felt not like a predator, but like a child, locked outside a room where adults were discussing his own execution. The plan on paper, the meticulously crafted defenses, the interlocking fields of fire was being dismantled, piece by bloody piece, by ghosts on the radio. He stared at the speaker, at the source of this linguistic phantom, and a cold dread, deeper than the fear of any bomb, settled in his gut. This wasn't a code to be broken. This was a mystery to be survived. And as the American shells found another of his countrymen, a single, impossible question burned through the fog of war: how do you fight an enemy who can speak with the voice of God? Lieutenant Tanaka's frantic report, a jumble of raw sound descriptions, panicked assertions, and hand-drawn attempts at phonetics, traveled thousands of miles east. It crossed the vast, indifferent blue of the Pacific, climbing the chain of command, shedding its urgency and terror with every step, until it was distilled into a single, sterile line item in the morning intelligence briefing at the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. There, in a cool, wood-paneled room that smelled of stale green tea and old paper, the chaos of Saipan was a world away. War was not a sound or a smell, it was a matter of logistics, of strategy, of predictable patterns. It was an equation to be solved. Colonel Hajiwara, a man whose face seemed carved from impassive granite, read the report from the Marianas. He tapped a long, manicured finger on the summary. A new American voice code, he stated, his voice as dry as dust. Unintelligible. To the men in Tokyo, this was not a terrifying ghost, it was a technical problem. The consensus formed quickly, a comforting blanket of logic pulled over a frightening anomaly. It will be a complex polyalphabetic substitution, one analyst suggested. Perhaps frequency hopping. Difficult, but not impossible. A matter of collecting enough traffic. Or a new form of voice scrambler, offered another. A mechanical distortion. We can filter it. Reverse the algorithm. It is a machine, and a machine can be understood. This became the official explanation. The ghosts were simply a new machine, a clever American trick. Orders were dispatched back to the front record everything. Collect hours of this new signal. The cryptographers in Tokyo, the finest minds in the empire, would solve this puzzle just as they had solved others. They would find the key, unmask the machine, and turn the enemy's weapon against them. In the meantime, field commanders were to assume the new transmissions were high priority, but to treat them as any other encrypted signal, a locked box that would, in time, yield its secrets. A temporary inconvenience. Back on Saipan, in the sweltering heat of his bunker, Lieutenant Tanaka received the orders from Tokyo. They felt like a letter from another universe. A machine? The word felt utterly wrong. A machine is repetitive. It is monotone. A machine doesn't curse when a mortar round lands too close. A machine doesn't have an accent. And most importantly, a machine is slow. This is where the official report, so clean and logical in Tokyo, began to bleed at the edges. Standard American field codes, the ones Tanaka knew so well, were laborious things. Imagine you have to send the message attack Hill 382 at dawn. You have a code book the size of a Bible. You look up attack. Its code group, Tango Victor Lima. You look up Hill 382. It's Whiskey Papa Sierra. You look up dawn. It's Romeo November Charlie. The whole process, from composition to transmission, could take minutes. Vital, life or death minutes. Tanaka had hours of recordings now. He queued up a standard marine transmission from the day before, a request for artillery support on a known grid coordinate. He timed it with his stopwatch. 2 minutes, 14 seconds from the start of the transmission to the confirmation from the artillery battery. Then, he played a recording of the ghost language. The speaker was calling in a strike on a Japanese mortar pit. The entire transmission, the request, the coordinates, the confirmation was over in 25 seconds. He did it again and again. The results were always the same. The official explanation wasn't just wrong, it was fatally, catastrophically wrong. This wasn't a man laboriously translating a message through a complex cipher. This was a man talking. Tanaka leaned back, the sweat from his neck sticking to the wooden chair. The men in Tokyo, with their charts and their theories, were preparing for a chess match. But the enemy wasn't playing chess. They were having a conversation at the speed of thought, and every syllable was a death sentence for his countrymen. The contradiction wasn't a matter of opinion or interpretation, it was right there, on the unforgiving face of his stopwatch. The ghosts on the radio weren't using a new machine to hide their words. The terrifying truth was infinitely simpler and infinitely more brilliant. They were using a new language as the code itself. The intelligence coming from the front lines of the Pacific War was not a river, it was a flood. But Lieutenant Tanaka's report, with its frantic stopwatch timings and assertions of a living language, was the piece of driftwood that caught Major General Seizo Arizu's eye. Arizu, the head of Army intelligence, was a student of his enemy. He didn't just study their order of battle, he studied their soul. He knew the Americans were industrial giants, but he also knew they were improvisers, pragmatists who valued speed and efficiency above all else. While others in Tokyo saw the ramblings of a panicked field officer, Arizu saw a terrifying possibility. He kept coming back to one damning number 25 seconds. To understand why that number chilled Arizu to the bone, you have to understand the brutal physics of modern warfare. Imagine a battlefield not as a place, but as a conversation between two commanders. One sees a threat, a machine gun, nest pinning down his men. He must observe it. He must then orient himself, figuring out where it is on his map. He must decide on a course of action, call for artillery. And finally, he must act, sending that message. This whole cycle takes time. The enemy commander is doing the same thing. The winner of any battle is almost always the one who can complete that cycle faster. The Japanese military machine was built on courage, discipline, and intricate planning. Its communication, however, was a bottleneck. A request for fire support was a delicate, time-consuming process of encoding, transmitting, decoding, and relaying. It was a 5-minute conversation. The Americans, even with their standard codes, were a little faster. A 3-minute conversation. But this new code, 25 seconds. It wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a reflex. In a closed-door meeting with the general staff, Arisu laid out the terrifying strategic implication. We are building the most elaborate fortresses in history on these islands, he argued, his voice low and urgent. Our strategy is to bleed the Americans for every inch of sand. This relies on our ability to conceal our positions, to ambush them, to force them into a meat grinder. He paused, letting the weight of his next words fill the silent room. This new code renders that strategy obsolete. It allows the Americans to turn their entire arsenal, their ships, their planes, their artillery, into a single, coordinated weapon that can react faster than a man can run. We dig a tunnel, they spot the entrance, and 25 seconds later it becomes a tomb. We set up a mortar, and before it has fired its third round, a naval shell has erased it from the earth. He was describing a weapon that was invisible, instantaneous, and perfect. It wasn't just a code, it was a nervous system for the American war machine, and it was strangling the Imperial Army. Saipan was a bloodbath, and Arisu now understood why. It wasn't just American numbers, it was American speed, a speed gifted to them by this phantom that lived in the radio waves. The official explanation was no longer just wrong, it was a death sentence for the Empire. The stakes were no longer about a single island. This was about the survival of Japan itself. If this code reached Iwo Jima, if it was used in the defense of Okinawa, the slaughter would be unimaginable. Arizu's words finally cut through the bureaucracy. The problem was elevated from a technical curiosity to a Tier 1 strategic threat. The hunt for the machine was over. A new hunt was about to begin. A small, elite team of intelligence officers and Nisei interrogators, second-generation Japanese Americans whose loyalty was now a priceless commodity, was to be formed. Their mission was not to sit in Tokyo and analyze recordings. Their mission was to go to the front. Their orders were simple, direct, and utterly ruthless: penetrate the fog of war, find the source of this language, and bring one of the speakers back. Not a machine, a man. They were to capture one of the ghosts alive. The hunt for a ghost begins with an echo. For General Arizu's new task force, the first echo came not from the bloody shores of Saipan, but from a quiet, dusty interrogation room in a prisoner-of-war camp on the Philippine island of Luzon. It was late 1943, months before the invasion of the Marianas, and the strange voice code was not yet a strategic crisis, it was a faint, intermittent whisper, a battlefield curiosity logged by a handful of listening posts. In that room sat a captured American Marine, a Corporal William Tully. He was not a signalman. He was a rifleman from the 1st Marine Division, captured during a skirmish on Bougainville. He was gaunt, sick with malaria, and utterly defeated. His interrogator was a young, American-educated officer named Captain Jiro Morita, one of the Nisei handpicked for Arizu's team. Morita's job was to sift through the minds of prisoners, looking for pebbles of information that might, one day, form a mountain. For days, the interrogation yielded nothing. Unit strengths, supply routes, morale, the standard, dreary catechism of war. Tully answered in monosyllables, his eyes vacant. Morita, sensing he was getting nowhere, switched tactics. He steered the conversation away from the present, away from the war, and towards Tully's past. He asked about home, about basic training in California. And that's when the first clue emerged. It wasn't a secret, it was an offhand complaint. Drill instructors were screaming at us day and night. Tully mumbled, his voice raspy. But there was this other bunch Indians. Real Indians. They had their own DI, a big Navajo fella. Yelled at him in their own language. Sounded like a damn turkey goblin. Weirdest thing I ever heard. Morita's pen stopped. He kept his face a mask of casual interest, but inside, a switch had been flipped. He gently prodded. Indians? In the Marines? Yeah, Tully shrugged. Whole platoon of them, seemed like. Kept him all together. Good Marines, tough as hell. But quiet. Never talked much English unless they had to. Always jabbering away in that Navajo stuff. Navajo. The word was a key. Morita had heard recordings of the ghost language. He had tried, like everyone else, to find a pattern, a rhythm that fit a known linguistic family. Japanese, Chinese, German, Russian, even obscure dialects had a certain predictable structure. But the recordings from the front? They were chaotic, full of sounds that felt alien. Turkey goblin. Tully's description was crude, but it was perfect. It captured the strange, tonal, guttural quality that had so baffled Lieutenant Tanaka. Morita excused himself and went straight to the camp's small intelligence library. He found a pre-war anthropological survey of North American indigenous peoples. He flipped to the section on the Athabascan language family. He read about the Navajo, a people whose homeland was the desolate, sun-baked canyonlands of the American Southwest. Their language was described as being of extreme complexity, with a syntax and tonal quality that had no parallel in Asia or Europe. It was a language isolate, a linguistic island. Crucially, the text noted, it was an unwritten language. It existed only as a spoken tradition, passed down through generations. There were no dictionaries, no grammar books, no Rosetta Stone. Suddenly, the brilliance of the American plan became terrifyingly clear. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't a complex cipher. It was a language, yes, but one that was perfectly, naturally, designed for secrecy. You couldn't break it in a lab in Tokyo because there was nothing to break. The only way to understand it was to have grown up speaking it. The team now had a name for their ghost Navajo. The discovery felt like a massive breakthrough, a ray of light piercing the fog. They weren't hunting a phantom anymore, they were hunting a specific group of men. The mission, which had seemed impossible, now felt achievable. Find the Navajo. Capture one. The war, for this small team, had just become intensely personal. Their optimism was palpable. The mystery was on the verge of being solved. All they had to do was get to the front, find a few men out of thousands in the chaos of an amphibious invasion, and take one alive. It sounded simple. It sounded clear. It was the kind of clean, confident plan that gets drawn up in the safety of the rear echelon, long before the first bullet is fired. The promising lead, the beautiful, simple theory born in the quiet of a Philippine POW camp, shattered the moment it met the reality of the Battle of Peleliu. Captain Morita and his small team of hunters arrived with the fourth wave of the Japanese garrison reinforcements, wading ashore into a Boschian hellscape of shattered coral, burning landing craft, and the relentless, concussive drumbeat of naval gunfire. Their mission to find and capture a Navajo felt absurdly clinical, like trying to collect a rare butterfly in the middle of a hurricane. The Americans were not cooperating. The 1st Marine Division, the same unit Corporal Tully had belonged to, was throwing itself at the island's main defensive line, a series of ridges and caves the Japanese had named the Yamurburgal Pocket. It was a fortress of limestone and coral, honeycombed with tunnels, pillboxes, and mortar pits. Here, the battle ceased to be one of maneuver and became a brutal, yard-by-yard shoving match fought with flamethrowers, grenades, and bayonets. Morita's team set up their listening post in a captured American bunker on the edge of the pocket. The air was thick with the stench of death and cordite. The radio crackled to life, and there it was again, the ghost language. But it was different now. On Saipan, it had been the voice of a distant, coordinating god. Here, on Peleliu, it was the frantic, desperate chatter of men in a knife fight. Shush. Bisodi. Daibe. Nahima. AKEHD Glenny. The transmissions were short, sharp bursts. A call for a smokescreen. A warning about a sniper. A plea for more plasma. The speed was still there, but now it was laced with panic. Yet, even in panic, it was brutally effective. Morita's team watched in horrified awe as a Marine platoon, pinned down by a machine gun nest, was saved. The ghost voice spoke, and less than a minute later, a perfectly placed mortar barrage silenced the Japanese gun. They were seeing the weapon in action, and it was everything General Arisu had feared. Their first plan was simple: get close enough to a Marine command post to identify the radio operator. They assumed the Navajo would be kept safe, a precious asset protected at the rear. This assumption, like so many others, was a fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated the enemy. They had underestimated the United States Marine Corps. On the third day, they got their chance. A small team, led by a hardened veteran sergeant, slipped through the lines at night. Their target was a company command post they had pinpointed through radio direction finding. They crawled on their bellies through razor-sharp coral and the decomposing bodies of both sides, the metallic tang of blood thick in their nostrils. After 2 hours, they were within 50 meters. They could hear the low murmur of American voices. The sergeant peered through his field glasses. He saw the radio man. He was a tall, broad-shouldered Marine, a PRC-10 radio strapped to his back, the long whip antenna swaying with his movements. But he wasn't sitting safely behind the lines. He was crouched next to his platoon leader, rifle in hand, peering into the darkness. As they watched, a Japanese infiltration team stumbled into the Marine perimeter. The night exploded in muzzle flashes and screams. The radio operator didn't just call for help. He dropped his handset, shouldered his M1 Garand, and fired 3 rounds, 3 distinct pings of an emptying clip. He was a rifleman first, a signalman second. The plan to snatch a safe rear echelon asset collapsed. The Navajo weren't protected specialists. They were frontline infantry, indistinguishable from any other Marine until the moment they picked up the handset. This wasn't a hunt for a technician, it was a hunt for a warrior. But the enemy's genius went even deeper. Over the next few days, Morita's team identified 3 more potential targets. Each time, they tried to organize an ambush, a snatch and grab. And each time, they failed. The moment they began to move, the moment they concentrated their forces for an attack, the ghost language would chatter, and an American patrol would suddenly appear on their flank, or a preemptive artillery strike would rain down on their staging area. It was a perfect, maddening feedback loop. The very weapon they were trying to capture was the thing that was preventing them from capturing it. They were not the hunters. They were flies, trapped in a web of invisible signals, and every move they made only alerted the spider to their presence. The enemy wasn't just using a code, they had weaponized the very act of communication. The simple theory, find a Navajo, capture a Navajo, was a dead end. They were playing a game where the opponent could read their minds. Hope, on a battlefield like Peleliu, is a dangerous commodity. It burns bright and fast, and when it's gone, the darkness that follows is absolute. For Captain Morita and his beleaguered team, hope was extinguished by attrition, ground into the island's bloody coral sand. Their elegant hunt had devolved into a desperate, reactive struggle for survival. The ghosts on the radio were no longer a puzzle to be solved, they were an omnipresent threat, the unseen architects of their destruction. Every Japanese ambush was broken up before it could form. Every counterattack met with a perfectly timed curtain of American steel. Morita's team was being bled white, not by grand assaults, but by 1,000 small cuts. A sniper round that seemed guided by Providence. A mortar shell that landed with uncanny accuracy on their observation post. It felt as if the very air had turned against them. The initial feeling of being hunted by an intelligent opponent had curdled into something far worse, a sense of futility, of being outmatched by a system so fast and so seamless it felt like magic. They were trapped in a dark room, and the enemy had invented night vision. Just as the last embers of their mission were dying, a flicker of light came from a place no one expected. It wasn't from a daring raid or a clever piece of signals intelligence. It came from the island's makeshift field hospital, a stiflingly hot series of caves where the stench of gangrene and antiseptic fought a losing battle against despair. Among the wounded was a young Japanese private named Nakamura. He'd been part of a forward artillery observation team before an American phosphorus grenade had burned half the skin from his back and arms. He was delirious with pain, drifting in and out of consciousness. But in one of his lucid moments, he spoke to a medical orderly, his voice a ragged whisper. He talked about his post, high on a ridge overlooking a sector the Americans called Five Sisters. He said they'd been watching a Marine unit for days, trying to pinpoint their command bunker. And then he said something that made the orderly freeze. The big one, the one with the radio, we almost got him. He described an ambush. His team had let a Marine patrol pass, waiting for the radio operator who always trailed behind. He was a big man, he said, broad-shouldered, carrying the heavy SCR 300 backpack radio. They had him in their sights. But just as they were about to open fire, a runner had appeared from the front of the patrol, shouting. The big radio operator had handed his rifle to the man next to him, taken the runner's message, and begun speaking into the handset. Not in English. In the other voice. The ghost voice. Nakamura's team had hesitated for a fatal second, confused. In that second, the radio operator finished his message, and the world exploded. An American tank, a Sherman they hadn't seen, rolled around a limestone outcropping and opened up with its coaxial machine gun, cutting Nakamura's entire team to pieces. The orderly, recognizing the potential significance, reported the story to his superior, and within an hour, Captain Morita was at Nakamura's bedside. The private was fading, but Morita leaned close, his ear inches from the man's lips, piecing together the fragmented story. He wasn't interested in the tank or the ambush. He was focused on one detail, a detail so small it would have been dismissed by anyone else as the ramblings of a dying man. Nakamura kept repeating it. He was so big, and he had a bodyguard. A bodyguard? Morita pressed gently. Yes, always. A smaller man. Never left his side. Carried an extra radio battery and a carbine. He watched. Always watched. In that moment, the entire battlefield reconfigured itself in Morita's mind. The lights that had dimmed by weeks of failure suddenly blazed with blinding intensity. He had been hunting for a voice. A fatal error. The Americans weren't hiding a voice, they were protecting a man. And that man had a shadow. This was the breakthrough. It was a complete reversal of their failed assumption. The Americans weren't treating the Navajo like ordinary grunts to be sprinkled throughout the line. They had created a new tactic on the fly. The code talker himself focused solely on communication, while another Marine was assigned to be his dedicated protector, his eyes and ears, his personal guardian angel armed with a carbine. They were no longer looking for a needle in a haystack. They were looking for a needle with a bright red thread tied to it. They were looking for a pair of men, always together, one big, one small. One carrying the heavy radio, the other carrying a light carbine and an extra battery. They were no longer hunting a ghost. They were hunting a pair of shadows. And now, for the first time, Morita knew exactly what to look for. The revelation from Private Nakamura's dying words was like a cipher key. Suddenly, the chaotic battlefield began to resolve into a discernible pattern. Captain Morita and the handful of men he had left were no longer scanning for a lone signalman. They were hunting for a two-man team, a distinct operational signature. They stopped trying to interpret the radio signals and started observing the men who sent them. From the hellish caves of the Yamurburgal pocket, they became anthropologists of their enemy, studying the small human rituals of the American war machine. For 3 days, they watched, their field glasses scanning the blasted landscape until their eyes burned. And then, they found them. It was a Marine fire team advancing on a fortified cave position designated Hill 140. Among them, Morita's spotter identified the familiar silhouette of the SCR-300 radio. And right next to him, almost tethered to him, was another Marine. This second man wasn't engaging the enemy. His head was on a constant swivel, his carbine held at the ready, his eyes scanning the ridges above. He was a sheepdog guarding the flock's most precious asset. The big man spoke into the handset, his voice lost to the wind and gunfire. The smaller man watched his back. It was the pattern. It was the pair. Following this pair with their optics, Morita's team began to piece together the full, terrifying truth of the Navajo system. It wasn't just a simple substitution code, where one Navajo word equals one English word. That would be too slow, too clunky. What they were witnessing was something far more ingenious, a beautiful and deadly piece of linguistic engineering. One afternoon, they watched the big code talker direct a naval bombardment. An officer gave him a grid coordinate. The code talker didn't read from a book. He spoke fluidly for a few seconds. Minutes later, 5-inch shells from a destroyer offshore rained down with pinpoint accuracy. Morita knew that transmitting a 6-digit grid coordinate using a standard letter-for-letter substitution would have taken far longer. Later that night, huddled in his command post, Morita stared at the scraps of information they had gathered. The speed, the fluidity, the lack of any reference materials. The pieces finally clicked into place, and the picture they formed was one of strategic genius. The Americans hadn't just weaponized a language, they had built a code within a language. The uncomfortable truth was this: the Navajo words themselves were not the code. They were the building blocks of a dizzying, multi-layered system. A word like Woolachi, which means ant in Navajo, was used to represent the letter A. Shush, meaning bear, stood for B. Mosi, cat, for C. For every letter of the English alphabet, they had chosen a Navajo word. To spell out a sensitive term like hill, the code talker would rapidly say the Navajo words for horse ice lamb lamb. It was a phonetic alphabet, hidden inside a language no outsider could understand. But that was just the first layer. For common military terms, they had created a substitution vocabulary, a dictionary of metaphors that was pure poetry. A submarine, beshlo, was an iron fish. A battleship, lotso, was a whale. A fighter plane, dihitai hai, was a hummingbird. Japan itself was Bainalitsosi, the slanted eye. America was Nehima, our mother. The commander of the Marine Corps, General Vandegrift, was given the code name Nashinkin, Big Chief. This was the source of the speed. The code talkers weren't spelling out every word. They were speaking in a kind of high-speed, metaphorical shorthand, a language of iron fish and hummingbirds that was completely impenetrable. Morita felt a wave of cold, professional admiration wash over him. It was brilliant. Utterly, devastatingly brilliant. It was also a truth his superiors in Tokyo would never want to hear. The official narrative was that the Japanese were being overwhelmed by American industrial might, by sheer numbers. It was an honorable defeat against a soulless machine. But this wasn't a machine. This was human ingenuity of the highest order. It was cleverness. It was artistry. It suggested that the enemy was not just stronger, but smarter. The truth they had uncovered was politically radioactive. To report that the Americans' ultimate weapon was not a new technology, but the ancient language of a people their own government had tried to eradicate, was an admission of a different kind of defeat. It implied a failure of imagination, a strategic blind spot that was now costing them tens of thousands of lives. This wasn't a report Morita could simply send up the chain of command. It was an accusation. The journey of Captain Morita's report from the bloody coral of Peleliu to the polished mahogany desks of the Second Bureau in Tokyo was a study in institutional inertia. His message, encoded with the highest priority cipher, was a desperate plea for a change in thinking. It was not a technical analysis, it was a testament to the enemy's genius. He laid out the two-layer system with chilling clarity, the phonetic alphabet hidden within Navajo words, and the metaphorical dictionary of iron fish and hummingbirds. He concluded with a stark, career-endangering assessment: this is not a code that can be broken by conventional means. Our only viable countermeasure is the immediate capture and interrogation of a speaker. All resources must be directed to this end. The system, however, does not like to be told it is wrong. The initial reaction in Tokyo was not alarm, but skepticism. It trickled down from the highest echelons of the general staff. General Arisu, who had championed the initial hunt, found himself on the defensive. A language of savages? One staff officer scoffed during a briefing, the disdain clear in his voice. You are suggesting the Americans have entrusted their most vital battlefield communications to uneducated primitives? The concept was, to the deeply hierarchical and racially conscious Japanese high command, offensive. It defied their worldview. Americans were a nation of engineers and industrialists, not poets and mystics. The cryptanalysis division, the very men who had been so certain the code was a machine, pushed back the hardest. Morita's report was an indictment of their failure. They produced their own counter-analysis, full of complex mathematical arguments. The speed Morita reports is theoretically possible with a well-drilled team using a one-time pad system, their chief argued. The metaphors he describes are likely just code names from a standard signals book that we have not yet captured. His theory is romantic, but it is not supported by our science. The bureaucracy was protecting itself. Admitting that Morita was right meant admitting that their entire approach for the last year had been a catastrophic waste of time and resources. It was easier and safer to brand Morita as a field officer who had lost his objectivity, a victim of battlefield stress. The official narrative that this was a complex but ultimately solvable technical problem was reasserted with renewed vigor. The response that finally reached Captain Morita on Peleliu was a masterpiece of bureaucratic condescension. It came not from General Arisu, but from a mid-level staff colonel. The message acknowledged his courageous efforts and unorthodox theory. However, it stated that the consensus of the technical experts in Tokyo was that he was mistaken. The resources for a dedicated manhunt were denied. His surviving team members were to be reintegrated into the island's main garrison. He was, in effect, being told to drop it. The final line of the message was the cruelest cut of all. It was a direct order: cease all independent intelligence operations regarding Allied voice communications. Focus on your duties as a line officer in the defense of your sector. Morita read the decoded message 3 times, the flimsy paper trembling in his hand. He was in a stiflingly hot cave, the air vibrating with the constant crump of mortar fire. He could hear, even now, the faint crackle of the radio in the corner, and he knew that at that very moment, a young man from a desert canyon half a world away was speaking in a language of whales and hummingbirds, directing a storm of steel that was systematically exterminating the men under Morita's command. He had handed his superiors the key to the enemy's soul, a truth forged in blood and observation, and they had dismissed it as a romantic theory. They had told him to stop thinking and start dying. The conflict was no longer with the Americans on the other side of the ridge. The real battle was now with his own high command, 1,000 miles away, who were determined to remain blind, even as their empire burned down around them. The system wasn't just pushing back, it had slammed the door in his face and ordered him to stand his post until the inevitable end. This was the bottom. For Captain Morita, it was a place far deeper and darker than any cave on Peleliu. His mission was over, his warnings ignored, his surviving men scattered among the desperate, starving remnants of the Japanese garrison. He was no longer an intelligence officer on a vital hunt, he was just another soldier waiting to die. The ghosts on the radio, once a fascinating mystery, were now a constant, mocking reminder of his failure. Their voices, chattering with impunity, were the soundtrack to his personal and professional ruin. The crushing weight of his situation was absolute. He had seen the truth, held it in his hands, and had been powerless to make anyone listen. The injustice was a physical ache, a cold knot in his stomach that no amount of thin rice gruel could soothe. He followed his orders. He became a line officer, leading doomed, suicidal banzai charges against fortified Marine positions at night. He fought with the cold fury of a man who had nothing left to lose, a fury born not of patriotism, but of profound, bottomless despair. He saw the consequences of Tokyo's blindness every single day. A platoon of his men would spend a full night silently dragging a heavy mortar to a new, concealed position. They would camouflage it perfectly, preparing for a dawn barrage. But just as the sun would rise, a single hummingbird, a Marine corsair, would appear as if from nowhere, strafing the position and turning the mortar pit into a crater of twisted metal and mangled bodies. The Navajo had seen them. The Navajo had spoken. The system he had tried to warn his superiors about was working with ruthless, heartbreaking efficiency. His lowest point came during the final, desperate days of the battle. The Japanese were trapped in the last warrens of the Yamurburgal pocket. Water had run out. Ammunition was nearly gone. The wounded were dying of sepsis in the darkness. Command had ordered one final, hopeless assault to break out of the encirclement. It was a suicide mission, and everyone knew it. Morita was tasked with leading a company less than 60 starving, exhausted men against a heavily defended ridge. As they gathered in the pre-dawn gloom, a runner brought him a message from the regimental commander. It was a fragment of an intercepted American transmission, painstakingly decoded by the beleaguered signals staff. It took them over an hour to break the low-level field cipher. The message read: enemy force, company strength, concentrating at grid coordinate 45 Baker. Prepare preemptive fires. Morita stared at the paper. It was his position. It was his company. The Americans knew exactly where they were and what they were planning. The conventional code had been broken, but it had taken the Americans an hour far too slow to stop the coming attack. But then, as his men began to fix their bayonets, Morita heard it. Faintly, from the American lines, carried on the morning air, he heard a radio squawk. And then, a voice. A Navajo voice. He couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. He knew exactly what it was saying. It was the same information, the same warning, but it was being transmitted in seconds. He had a choice. He could obey his orders and lead his men into a perfectly prepared kill zone, a slaughter orchestrated by the very system he had tried to warn them about. Or he could disobey, try to save the men under his command, and be shot for cowardice. He looked into the hollow eyes of the soldiers around him, boys of 18 and 19 who were about to be sacrificed on the altar of high command's arrogance. The inevitable was no longer a theory, it was a wall of American machine guns zeroed in on his chest. The disaster he had tried to prevent was now irrevocably in motion. He gave the signal to advance. The crushing weight wasn't just failure anymore. It was complicity. He was leading his men to their deaths, fully aware that the enemy knew their every move, and that the order to kill them had been given in a language of ghosts his own country had refused to believe existed. The Banzai Charge was not a battle, it was an act of ceremonial suicide, a final, screaming protest against the cold arithmetic of modern war. Captain Morita and his 60 men erupted from the caves, not with the disciplined fire and maneuver of a textbook assault, but with the collective, guttural roar of souls already departed. They ran forward, a wave of ragged khaki and gleaming bayonets, into a night lit by the starbursts of parachute flares. From the perspective of the Marines on the ridge, it was a terrifying, almost pitiable sight. For a moment, the sheer fanaticism of the charge seemed like it might succeed. But the ghosts had already done their work. The moment the first Japanese soldier broke cover, the American response was not chaotic or reactive, it was symphonic. It was the perfectly rehearsed performance of a slaughter. A machine gun on the left flank, precisely sighted, opened up, its tracer rounds a solid, glowing scythe that cut the legs out from under the first wave. As the Japanese survivors instinctively veered right, a second machine gun, waiting for them, joined the chorus. They were not being fought, they were being herded into a prearranged kill box. Morita saw it all with a horrifying clarity, the battlefield unfolding exactly as the Navajo's warning had predicted. He saw a young private, a boy from a fishing village near Nagasaki, get halfway across the no-man's land before a single, well-aimed rifle shot snapped his head back. He saw a veteran sergeant, a man who had survived China and the Philippines, get vaporized by a mortar round that seemed to drop from the heavens directly into his path. This was the direct, tragic consequence of the ignored warning. Every American gun seemed to know where the Japanese would be a second before they got there. The entire ridge erupted in fire, a wall of lead and steel that rose up to meet the charge. There was no heroism in it, only the brutal, efficient process of extermination. Morita was hit twice. The first bullet shattered his left shoulder, spinning him around. The second ripped through his thigh, dropping him to the sharp coral ground. He lay there, his life bleeding out into the dirt, watching the last of his men die. He saw a small group, no more than 5, actually reach the American wire. They clawed at it, trying to get through, before a Marine with a flamethrower stepped out of a bunker and washed them away in a torrent of liquid fire. The entire assault, from the first shout to the last dying scream, was over in less than 3 minutes. The silence that followed was more profound than the noise it replaced. Morita lay among the dead and dying, his vision blurring. He looked up at the indifferent stars, at the smoke drifting across the face of the moon. He had failed. His country had failed. The arrogance of Tokyo, their refusal to see the brilliant, simple truth, was paid for here, in the blood of these boys, on this forgotten rock in the middle of the ocean. The catastrophe he had foreseen was complete, and its architect was a voice he could hear even now, calm and professional, reporting on the radio from the ridge above, target neutralized. The war ended, not with a bang, but with the stunned, silent whimper of a nation brought to its knees. Captain Jiro Morita did not die on Peleliu. He was found, barely alive, by a Marine burial detail and spent the next year in a hospital ward in Hawaii, a ghost haunted by the ghosts he had once hunted. He returned to a Japan he no longer recognized, a landscape of ashes and shame. He never spoke of his mission, of the code, or of the warnings that had been ignored. The file on the unintelligible voice code, like so much of the Imperial War record, was either burned in the final days or buried deep in the archives of the occupying American forces. His truth was locked away. The mystery, for the rest of the world, remained. The years turned into decades. The world moved on. Morita became an old man, a quiet history teacher in a small Kyoto suburb. He taught his students about the rise of the shoguns and the Meiji Restoration, but he never taught them about the war he had fought. Then, one spring morning in 1968, a package arrived from an American colleague, a fellow historian at the University of California. Inside was a recently declassified U.S. government document and a short, simple note. Jiro thought you might find this interesting. The document was thin, its title stark and bureaucratic. Program code talk, United States Marine Corps, 1942 to 1945. Final after-action report. Morita's hands, now wrinkled and spotted with age, trembled as he read. It was all there, page after page, laid out in the cold, precise language of a military report. The recruitment of the first 29 Navajo men from the reservations of Arizona and New Mexico. The development of the two-layer code system at Camp Pendleton. The list of metaphorical terms: Lotso for battleship, Beshlo for submarine, Ingma for our mother, America. It was his report from Peleliu, written 24 years earlier, now confirmed in every single devastating detail. He read about the more than 400 Navajo men who served, fighting in every major marine assault from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. He read that the code was never, not once, broken by the Japanese. He read a quote from a signals officer at Iwo Jima, stating that in the first 48 hours of the invasion, the code talkers had passed over 800 messages without a single error, a feat that would have taken the standard cryptographic machines over 30 hours. They had done the impossible in minutes. The declassified file was his vindication. It was the official, undeniable proof that he had been right. Every doubt, every dismissal, every condescending reply from Tokyo was swept away by the stark facts on the page. He hadn't been a hysterical field officer. He hadn't succumbed to a romantic theory. He had been the one man in the entire Japanese military who had seen the truth. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he was no longer an old man in a quiet room, but a young captain in a dark cave, listening to the future coming for him over the radio. The fog of war, for him, had finally, completely, lifted.